Well, thanks for this opportunity to talk to your group, and hello, everybody. Nice to have everybody on here. Um, so we're going to talk about the U.S. Drug quality and regulatory environment today. We're obviously going to stay at a pretty high level with this, given the short period of time, and we could speak for days about all the intricacies of this process. But at least going to give you some flavor and maybe help you understand some things you might not have been aware of with this. So I'm Steve Gompertz. As Jennifer said, I'm a consultant to the med tech industry. I've been in the industry for 34 years now, after 7 years in the computer industry before that. So I've been around the block a few times, seen all kinds of different medical technology, worked for some of the bigger companies, and consult to a lot of different types of companies. I'm also an instructor at St. Cloud State University here in Minnesota, where we have a master's degree program in medical technology quality that I helped them develop. And now I've been teaching 4 courses there for this is the 14th year we're doing this. Educational wise, I'm supposed to be a mechanical engineer, but I was never a mechanical engineer. I went, like I said, into the computer industry where I did software development for electrical engineering applications, and then finally found my way into the med tech industry and found a home there and stayed there. And I've been through all kinds of different certifications to shore up my background there. My contact info is on here. So please feel free to reach out to me. I mean, we're obviously going to leave time for questions. And by the way, I encourage questions as we go. I don't know, Jennifer, if everybody's able to just open their mic and say something. If you would watch the chat area, see if it pops up there, that would be great because I probably won't be able to keep an eye on it. But otherwise, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and hit me up with emails afterwards. I'm happy to answer questions about the stuff. My business partner, Mark Swanson, is also on the line, and he might be chiming in with some color commentary from time to time. Mark, you want to say hi?
Hello, everybody. Great to see you and glad to be here.
Yeah. So Mark's got a similar background to me. He's been in the industry for a long time. Um, Mark is interesting because when we talk a lot about the various standards, he's actually involved in development of quite a few of the ISO standards. So you've heard of things like ISO 9000, 9001, 1345, and 14971. He's actually been part of the teams that developed those, and he's actually working on updates to some of those right now. So Mark and I met as instructors at St. Cloud. So Mark is also there. He was the program director for a while. And he's also fully certified and well educated on all of this stuff. All right, so what we're going to cover today, like I said, we're going to kind of go over the basics, right? Where does this all come from? What are the important words to remember? And then, we'll extend from there into, so what are the pathways? Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I swallowed something the wrong way there. And there is more than one way through this. I mean, there's kind of the general path, but there are some other ways to get through the process, and we'll talk a little bit about those as well. And then we'll touch on some of the other regs and guidance documents that play into assuring that you have good quality management in the development and production of your drugs and ensure that they're safe and effective. So the basis for all of this, if you've not heard of it before, we refer to this thing called the Act. The full name is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act of 1938, or the FD&CA. But again, even the FDA just calls it the Act. And this is the basis for everything that FDA does. As the name would imply, it covers a lot of different areas. And drugs is certainly part of the original scope of the Act. And over time, it's been updated to add things like medical devices, which weren't really well called out in the original version, but those things got added later. And so as technologies move forward and other types of products that go under FDA's responsibilities come into play, then the Act gets updated accordingly. But it kind of sets the foundation for how FDA does what it does without getting very specific at times. But one of the things it does that's important, because it covers so many different types of things that FDA is responsible for, is the definitions of things like, so what is a drug? right? How do you know if you're producing a drug? And it's like a lot of government documents, it's got a long definition. But in this case, it starts with being that a drug has to be a substance that's listed on one of the pharmacopoeias or formularies. Most people are familiar in the U.S. with the USP, right? U.S. Pharmacopoeia. You pick up any drug, and somewhere on the label you'll see those letters USP, usually followed by a number which tells you what part of the USP references this type of drug. Uh, so it's required that whatever you're going to produce is listed in a formulary or a pharmacopoeia. And the other really big criteria is that it's a substance used for things like diagnosis, curing, mitigating, treating, and preventing diseases. Okay, um, and the other piece of it that's interesting is that it also applies to things that affect the body structure or function in some way. And so, like a good example might be Botox to address, the youthful look of your skin. Right? Botox has some other uses that are for diseases, but wrinkles are not diseases, right? So under the second sub bullet, Botox for dressing wrinkles would not be a drug. But when you think about how Botox works, it alters the structure of your skin tissue, and therefore, under the third sub bullet, that makes it a drug in that regard. So there's a lot of subtleties to this, but it's important to keep these kind of pieces in mind. And then you're also producing a drug if it's a substance that's used as a component of a medicine. Think of NyQuil, right, which has got a whole bunch of different things in it, some of which are active, some of which, like alcohol is in there. Uh, but it also has typically like ibuprofen in it or acetaminophen. Okay, so even though they're used in the context of a broader medicine, they are still considered individual drugs as part of that, since they are a component of that medicine. I'm not going to be doing a deep dive in this today, but there are biologically based drugs as well. So biologics is the shorter term for that. They basically fall under the same definition. They just act in a different way and they're produced in a different way. And they are governed by a different part of FDA. If you're doing a drug, you're under what's called CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. If you're doing a biologic, you're under CBER, which is the Center for Biological um, Evaluation and Research. So a lot of whether it's a biologic or chemically based drug, um, basically the big difference is how they're processed, right? When you're making a drug, a typical drug, it's chemistry and process, right? When you're making a biologic, it's processing of biological materials, right? So those are the kind of the bigger differences, but they are very similar in the requirements. But we're not going to do a deep dive into biologics today. We're going to stick to the basic kind of drugs there. So terminology in the regulatory world is always really important to get the words right, right? FDA, if you haven't been to the FDA website, it's a great resource. I always recommend going there. If you had asked me this 20 years ago, I would say don't go to the FDA website. They've made great strides and have just all kinds of really good databases and white papers and guidance documents and just web pages that are really good at explaining everything. And one of those is the one that's shown here. You can click on this link when you get a copy of the slides and get the definitions related to drugs. So we talk about the definition of drug. There's some others. There's one similar to that called drug product. And drug product is basically the finished version of that drug, right, in its dosage form. So you could have a drug, um, lisinopril, which is used for high blood pressure, right? And you know what the chemistry of that is and why it's a drug, but then it comes in different, dosages. I think there's a 2.5 milligram, a 5 milligram, a 10 milligram, right? So those are the drug products. So think of the drug product as kind of the variants of the drug um, that tell you, okay, this is how it's going to be delivered and presented to the patient, essentially. The term active ingredient, right? As I said, there's often lots of things in a drug. Not all of them are directly related to performing whatever the drug is intended to do from a pharmacological perspective, right? They don't necessarily actually have an effect as part of the treatment. These could be things like, the inactive ingredients are things like colorants and flavorants and things like that. Um, if you look at NyQuil, it's got alcohol, like I said, not really an active ingredient, right? It's just there because it probably helps you sleep a little bit, but that's not really part of addressing your cold symptoms, as the ibuprofen and the antihistamines that are in there, which are clearly the active ingredient parts of NyQuil. And then you have combination products. So this is where you put a drug and a device, or a biologic and a device, together. So things like a drug-eluting stent, where they coat a stent in paclitaxel to encourage tissue growth around the stent to hold it in place, or pre-filled syringes, right? We look at all the GLP-1 drugs, the Ozempics and the Wegovy's and such, that come in a pre-filled pen, injector pen, right? The injector pen is a device. Obviously, the Ozempic inside it is the drug. You put them together, and you're into a different realm of requirements potentially. Actually, you have to address both sides of the product, and so you get to deal with more than one element of FDA at the same time. So, on the device side, you have CDRH, which is the Center for Device and Radiological Health. So you end up with combination products, again, having to understand the requirements of a device and the requirements of a drug. And you have to make a decision about which is it more? Is it more a drug? Is it more a device? But either way, you still have to kind of satisfy two parts of FDA, maybe more. If it's, there's also areas related to blood and the biologics. You could actually have a combination product that goes beyond just two types of things. It could incorporate more than two. We're not going to do a deep dive again on combination products, but if you're doing that, just be aware that there are additional regulations and guidance documents that will apply to your product. So this is always the big one, so who is the manufacturer of a drug? And I don't know if you pay attention to FDA warning letters. I read all of them every week because they're very interesting. You see some interesting trends. And often what you see is companies that didn't realize that they were the manufacturer. And they should have, because it's all laid out in the Act and in other regulations. But basically, the Act tells you that if you're a firm that owns or operates an establishment that manufactures a drug, you are the manufacturer. And that includes, like, if you're just providing contract laboratory services, if you're the actual manufacturer, if all you're doing is packing drugs, right? So somebody sends you, kind of loose pills, and you're the packager who puts them into the, the things you can press the tablets out of, or if you're just applying a label, right? So you got a drug, and multiple companies are going to put their own label on it, and you're the company who puts the labeler on there, or sorry, you're the one who owns the label, right, with your company's name on it. You go, I didn't make that drug. You put your brand on it, on your label. Guess what? You're now considered a drug manufacturer, right? So you can't really escape this too easily. And in terms of the word manufacturer or manufacturing, it's pretty broad again. It covers, if you're the person doing the preparations, the propagation, the compounding, the processing, the manipulation, you can read all of this. But it's intentionally broad because basically FDA didn't want to create a lot of wiggle room, right? If you're doing something that relates to producing that drug, you can't escape the fact that you were under the regulations, is really what it comes down to. And that you have certain liabilities and requirements that apply to you. And you can't say, oh, but we're not actually doing that. That's not going to fly. These rules apply to both domestic and foreign establishments. If you're a foreign establishment or dealing with a foreign establishment, you need to understand that there are then additional requirements on those foreign establishments. And that can be things like having a representative in the U.S. if they don't actually have a business office here. And other rules that will apply to a foreign establishment. They're not exempt from getting inspected by FDA in wherever country they're located. So the rules apply equally to both, and then there's additional rules that apply to the foreign establishments. And we run into this a lot, particularly with early stage companies with our clients, where they go, oh, well, I'm not a manufacturer because I'm farming everything out. I've got a company that's developing the science for me. I got another company that's going to do the production. I got another company that's going to package, label, and distribute. I'm just here to like collect the money, collect the orders, and send it out, right? And maybe even you farm that out, the sales part of it. Doesn't matter if your company's name is the one that's on that label. Doesn't matter how much of the work you did or didn't do. You are the legal manufacturer, and therefore you are responsible for complying with all the regulations and making sure that all those outsourced organizations you're using are also compliant, right? Because essentially you're making them an extension of yourself. So they would also need to be in compliance with the regulations so that you can be deemed in compliance with those regulations. All right, so let's look at the basic process here. I'm going to show it first in words, step by step, 1 through 5 steps. And then I'll show it visually, so it'll be a little clearer. But everything starts with the basic research. Right? You got to figure out the science behind it. Right? What chemicals might possibly have an impact on whatever it is I'm trying to solve, right, or deal with? Are there technologies involved? Maybe the way in which that those chemicals are processed. What's the formulation? How much of each chemical, right? In what format? Then you start to figure out like what's the likely dosage, right? That will actually produce the right effect. How are we going to deliver it? Is it an injectable? Can it be taken a spoonful at a time? Have to be a pill, right? You need to figure that stuff out. And then you start getting an idea of, well, what do we think the effectiveness? How effective is it going to be at treating or curing or whatever it is we're trying to get it to do? And as a result of that, what kind of risks are we going to run into, or is this going to present? And also start thinking about, again, nobody ever typically takes just one drug. Usually you're taking multiple drugs, whether they're over the counter or prescription. And you need to start looking at, well, wait, are there potentials for interactions between things, right? So we have to tell people, well, while you're taking this drug, you can also be taking this, right? And vice versa. So that's step 1, right? Is figure it all out. What is this thing? How are we going to make it, right? All the basic development steps. From there, now you got to start proving something about it. So, you're not ready to put it in humans, but you got to do as much, investigation as you can to demonstrate basic safety is really what it comes down to. How do I know I'm not going to poison somebody instead of curing them? Do I know to what degree the effects are going to be? Do I know what the side effects are going to be? Right? Can I predict that through some basic preclinical testing, which you either do in the lab, right? In vitro testing, we're going to, test it against different compounds and analytical methods and whatever, break it down into its cellular level, those kind of things. And then in vivo, which is again not human, but now you can test it in animals, right? So do animal studies to get some preliminary information on toxicity and biocompatibility and other things, right? You could start to, there are certain animals, right, that are physiologically somewhat equivalent to human anatomy, and so you can start to get a sense for does this actually have an impact on the part of the human body that I expect it to, based on the effect on the same anatomy within a pig, for instance. Pigs, for some reason, seem to be really compatible with humans in that regard. So you're trying to generate as much preliminary information to show that, yeah, I think we're on the right track here. And by the way, none of this is necessarily meant to be sequential. Some of this will happen in parallel, right? Your preclinical steps 1 and 2 will definitely be happening in parallel and iterating through that, right? As you start moving towards a point where you feel like, hey, I think we've been able to demonstrate that we've done our due diligence. And the next logical step would be to actually try it on human beings, right? So actual clinical trials, which requires you to get permission from the FDA through what's called an investigational new drug application, or an IND, right? Where you've got to convince FDA, I did my due diligence. Everything tells us that we seem to be on the right track and we're probably not going to kill anybody, right? But to be sure of all this, right, and to refine our knowledge, we're going to have to eventually try it on humans. There's 4 phases to that. I'm going to talk about those a little later, but it's not like you do one trial and go, there we go, success. It's kind of an evolution, and I'll talk about that on a slide where I show it more graphically. From there, you do all these clinical trials, you generate the information, hopefully everything goes right, and you get to the point where you feel like you can submit to the FDA through a new drug application. By the way, I will do a little bit deeper dive into the IND and NDAs on slides coming up here. So the NDA is the mechanism that you submit with all of your data and information to get FDA to do its review and tell you whether or not they agree that your drug should be on the market. There is a variant of that called the abbreviated new drug application. If you're producing a generic, obviously you don't need to produce as much information because the drug is already in its proprietary form, has already been approved through its own NDA. So FDA already understands, right, the science. So you don't need to prove that a generic drug works. It's more you're going to prove that you can actually duplicate it, right, in a consistent way so that it will continue to do what the brand name version of it does. As part of this process, FDA is likely to do some what they call BMO inspections, bio research monitoring. They're going to go to the places where you did your clinical studies, and they're going to confirm that they followed the protocols, they used the right type of patient population, right? That they dotted all the I's, they crossed all the T's. The data they generated is valid because they followed the procedures and the right people were doing the work. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the NDA in more detail. And then ultimately, more than likely than not, FDA is going to use one of its advisory committees. They're going to pick people who have the right science and medical backgrounds that reflect on your drug, right, to confirm that they agree that what you're showing them makes sense, that the claims conclusions you're reaching, they agree with them, and then they will advise FDA on whether or not they think it makes sense to follow through with an approval. And you've probably seen examples of this. FDA typically listens to what the advisory committees say. Sometimes they don't, which could be in either direction. The advisory committee can come back and say, yep, this all looks good. And FDA can go, yeah, we're still not there yet. And so we're not going to approve. And the opposite has happened where the advisory committee has said, we're not convinced. And FDA has said, yeah, but we are. And so we are going to move forward with it. But more often than not, they're going to get the right minds to look at your drug and assess what you've provided there. At that point, if everything goes well, you get approved and now you're on market. And so the final piece of the puzzle is, of course, you're not done. You are responsible for monitoring use of your drug for as long as it's available. And FDA will stay engaged as well. So they are likely to do follow-on inspections of your facilities to make sure you are continuing to produce the drug safely and correctly. You may do supplemental applications where you say, oh, now we want this drug to be approved for these conditions, right? Look at Ozempic. So I'm going to use that a lot because everybody's pretty familiar with it. But you can see lately, over the last year and a half, Eli Lilly keeps coming back with supplemental applications. They go, oh, well, now we found out Ozempic is effective for treating this, and now for this, right? Those are the supplemental applications that weren't part of the original, but now they want to expand their claims on that drug. You're responsible for keeping an eye on when adverse events happen. So when there's any alleged harm that may have involved your drug, you're responsible for reporting that to FDA and performing trend analysis and investigation. That's part of the other regulations as to what you're supposed to do with all of that information besides just reporting it. Know that FDA is keeping an eye on you. They will watch your advertising and make sure that you aren't going past the approved claims. And that they will do their own, watching of the adverse event data and anything else that's out there about your drug. If somebody else does a study, clinical study on your drug, or writes a white paper, article in the journal, American Medical Association or something, FDA watches that, and they're looking to see, is there any other information that gives them pause and makes them want to talk to you some more, or maybe come on site, those kind of things. So that you're not done when you get on the market and just start collecting money, right? You have a lot of responsibilities once you're in the market to continue to show that the drug continues to be as effective as you had predicted to be and all your clinical studies had shown it to be. So let's look at this more visually, right? A lot of words just went by in the last two slides, so just more visually, right? So again, it starts with that basic research. You got to figure out, you know, is there a chemical or a compound that may look, like a good possibility to treat a particular condition? Then you got to refine that, right? All right, great. We have some basic research. Looks like this chemical likely could do something good. How? How do we produce it? How do we deliver it? How much of it? How much of it is bad versus how much do you need for it to be good? Are there alternatives to that chemical? Something else maybe that's a little more readable or readily available, or something that's just known to be safer. Those kind of things. And then, as I talked about, right, you start doing that preclinical research, which would overlap with discovery and development, right? Because you're going to iterate through all this, and you're going to do those in vitro and in vivo testing to make sure you really start to understand the nature of the drug you want to get on market. And all of this is you're building up your rationale, right, to support submitting that investigational new drug application. We are asking FDA, can we start using this on humans to make sure that it actually does what we think it does? But everything up until now seems to be looking good, right? We've done our risk analysis. We've tested for all of that. We've looked at all the chemistry and understand the science of it and how it might interact with other chemicals and things like that. We've done some animal studies and show it does appear to show effectiveness. You're going to build that case and give that all to FDA, along with here's how the protocols are going to look for the procedures we're going to follow in the trials. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. If they say yes, then you get to have your clinical trials. And again, I mentioned that this is done in phases. And so phase one is your small phase. Obviously, you're not going to jump right in and give this drug that's never been in a human being before to a lot of human beings. You're going to be using a very narrow subset of the patient population. You're probably going to look, which are the most likely targets, right, for this drug, and let's start with them before we start expanding the population to be more diverse. Limited number of people, typically less than 50. This is a phase that typically goes somewhere on the order of 6 months or so, right? Because you're just trying to get that initial look at, okay, now that we put it in a human being, does it appear to be safe? Do we see any unexpected side effects or impacts, or some initial looking at whether there's any um, interactions with other drugs? Although typically you might want to limit the population to, we only want patients who are not taking certain types of drugs, right? So we don't want to get too many variables in there. And you start to get a sense for initial sense of, is the dosing looking correct, and that kind of thing. Assuming that all goes well, then phase two, you're going to expand that population, right? Let's get a little more diversity, right? Go to some additional types of patients, and now to see, do we still see broad effectiveness across multiple types of human beings? Do we learn anything more about side effects, right? We're really trying to nail down the safety and effectiveness part of this before we go to a much broader trial. Again, typically still not a lot of patients, somewhere, around 100 or less. Probably looking at 6 to 12 months of effort here, maybe a year and a half, depending on what you're trying to understand and its impacts. But you're still kind of in limited testing at this point. And then all of that's leading towards, all right, we want to do our full phase 3 studies. Now we're going to really expand it to all the patient populations that we are going to try to include in our claim when we submit our NDA. And now we're going to compare it to existing treatments. How are we, right? If you take our drug versus using this device or using this approach, do we see improvement over that? Or at least we are achieving the same degree of impact, right? Maybe with some lesser risks or something like that. Do we see in this nice, broad, diverse population now any other types of patient impacts? Does it improve quality of life? How long does it last, right? Do the effects last? You're still looking at, are there any odd side effects? Do we see, what kind of variability do we see now that we have this broader population, right? What are the variances we see in the effectiveness and things like side effects? I mentioned longevity, interactions you're always watching, right? Because now you're expanding it. Now you're talking with patients who are possibly taking a lot more different types of drugs or other diseases that come into play. Now, again, that would be part of your protocol, is what you want to limit for your subjects to make sure they match, and don't add too many uncontrollable variables in the discussion. But you are trying to expand the number of variables here and get a really good view of what your drug is capable of, in both good and bad, right? When I say capable of. And all of this is leading towards, I want to get to a point, right, where I can submit an NDA, okay? So that I got all my ducks in a row. I'll show them more about what else you're supposed to submit, but everything is ready to go. FDA, please look this over. We think we're ready to go on the market. Ask us any question, right? Then you get into that FDA review and approval phase, and I will talk more about that in a bit as well when we talk about the NDAs. And then again, if everything goes well, you get to go on the market, okay? And now you've got that post-market piece where you're not done, right? You are responsible for your drug for as long as it's available on the market. And I mentioned there were 4 phases of clinical trials. This is where you would do that 4th phase, which is, well, now that we're out there and now we got lots and lots of patients, right, who are actually taking this on a regular basis, whether over the counter or prescription, now we can start gathering some real world evidence, right? We can see how does it actually work with different types of patients in different situations and different combinations with other diseases and other treatments and all that, right? All the variables come together here. This is, again, right, large population and typically done over a long period of time to understand, right, what are those long-term implications of my drug being in use there. I'm going to pause for a second. I don't know, Jennifer, are there any questions in the chat? I'll take that as a no.
No, no question.
Okay, good.
Mark asked a question though.
Just the questions I've been throwing out there. If anybody started this process or if they're in a phase, does this stuff look familiar to you? Have you seen it before? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't want to be like talking to people and say, we already got this, Steve.
I would say for the majority of the group, yes, they're familiar with this, but it's a great refresh.
Okay. Well, we're going to go into a little bit more detail in the next few slides here. So, and then we're going to get to the other pathways, and I think that might be of interest to people. So, all right. So let's look at that IND application. There are typically 3 types that FDA recognizes. One that they call investigator. More often than not, people refer to as investigational or investigatory. This is the most common, right? We're developing a new drug and I need to know whether it works in a human being. But there are INDs for emergency use. We go, look, we got a special situation, and maybe that's a certain limited population of patients with particular requirements, or it could even be an individual patient, right? Where you go, look, we really need to move this quick because we think the data shows that we could have an impact for these people. And so we need to move this quick. I'm going to talk about how you can expedite, some of the process around that. But you'd still do an IND, right, to get permission to do some testing. And then the treatment version of an IND is where if you're doing all your preclinical or non-clinical testing, and you go, man, this really looks promising, right? And it would address something very serious or life-threatening. You go, and all the logic says this is the thing we've been waiting for. Then again, this type of IND alerts FDA going, we think we have something special here that we may want to move it faster. And so we need you to approve the IND quicker so we can prove that as quickly as possible. Categorically, either you're a commercial operation, you're the drug manufacturer, and of course you want to get an IND to test your new drug. But there's also research INDs. So it could be organizations like universities and doctors and scientists with actually no connection to you as the manufacturer can also apply for INDs to go, hey, I want to do some researches on this drug to see, I believe it might be capable of doing this, right? Or I'm worried about its side effects and I don't think they've been fully investigated, so I'm going to do my own. So you have commercial, where the company's doing it, or you can have research organizations request INDs as well. As part of your IND, and again, I'm going to show you a list of all the regulations, but I mentioned earlier one of them that has tells you all about how to do an IND. But you're basically going to provide all the data, right, that you've generated, particularly around things like pharmacology and toxicology studies, which would probably be done in animal, although some of it could be in vitro or simulation kind of stuff, right? But they're going to want to see, how do you know this thing is safe? You're going to have to tell them about your manufacturing processes. How do you control the manufacturing of this drug to ensure that what you're about to test on humans has been produced correctly, using the right formulation, the right processes, the right, aseptic conditions. You have to demonstrate you have control over that production process. And then you got to show them, here's how we're going to run our clinical trials. This is the exact procedure. Here's who's going to be included. Here's who's going to be excluded from it. How many patients, right? Those kind of things. Where are we going to do it? And then the last piece is telling them, so who's going to perform these investigations as part of this? They need to know, what are those qualifications for the people that are going to run the trials? Do they have the right credentials, or are you going to make them produce the right credentials to show that they are capable of generating valid information that ultimately you're going to use to shore up your NDA? And one of the key things here is the timing. You need to do this at least 30 days before you intend to initiate the trial. And there's not a lot of bandwidth on that. You can't go 6 months in advance. It all needs to be pretty recent information to when you're going to do the trials. So typically that 30-day is kind of a magic mark where you go, this is where we need to get in there and get ready. So it's not like, oh, let's get an INDA and then go, oh yeah, we'll figure out where and when, and a year down the line, that's not going to fly. You should be ready to go, and now you just need FDA to agree that it's okay for you to do that. You do have the option to hold pre-INDA meetings with FDA. Our recommendation is, don't make it an option, do it. Anytime you can talk to FDA in advance, you want to take that opportunity. A long time ago, there used to be kind of a wisdom of, well, don't ask FDA, they're just going to say no, and now they know what we're doing. It's the opposite now. You want that feedback because they're going to tell you in advance before you go too far down a path where you're guessing at what they want. And if you get it wrong and they go, sorry, that's not sufficient, you have to start over, right? Why would you want to do that? So the best thing is, yeah, take advantage of the opportunity to do pre-IND meetings. They don't cost anything other than time, right? And it's not a huge amount of time. It might be 2 to 3 months. If you're going to do multiple meetings, right, that can extend from there. But what you get back will be well worth it because like I said, you won't be guessing at what they're expecting you to do.
One of the things that has been coming up and lots of people asking, with the upset of the newer administration coming in, whether these timelines have been longer, and we have not seen that. We interface with FDA on behalf of several clients, and the timelines still seem to be holding firm to what they've said they want to do as targets.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out because it's been our experience that nothing's really changed. So whether that's doing these kind of meetings or reviews, even down to I was having a technical issue with one of their databases one day, and I sent in a help desk ticket and got a response in 24 hours. So people are working at FDA and doing their jobs. All right. So any questions about the IND before I move on to the NDA?
There's a question from Linda. She says, what about a catalyst meeting?
Mark, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, they are common and do help move things forward. In our experience, FDA has actually been declining these catalyst requests because they don't have the resources and they don't see much value. But it certainly is something you can request. And my recommendation is, again, as Steve said, interface with the FDA and show them that you're hungry, that you're ready to go, and that always helps in the interface. Okay.
Thanks, Mark. All right, so let's move on to the NDA then. Again, you're typically going to have a pre-NDA meeting. Actually, I don't know why it says typically. I probably should have just said you're going to have a pre-NDA meeting. Unless things are like so totally obvious and you're doing a drug that's just really ubiquitous. And now I suppose with a generic, you might not need a pre-NDA meeting. But with anything new, you're gonna want that meeting. FDA is going to want to have that meeting. And basically, they're going to make sure, are you actually ready, right? Before you waste anybody's time submitting all this stuff that they're going to have to look through, they're going to want to be sure about that. And then they can, before they assign you an NDA number, and you'll want to sit down with them. And again, this has got that 30-day kind of thing about it where you want to do it right when you're ready, right? Because you don't want to be wasting anybody's time and go, well, we're not really ready to move to the next step or answer questions, which would say, well, then why are you submitting? So it's that last step and just gone, let's just make sure you dotted the I's, cross the T's. You have everything that's going to be required for the application in the right form that tells the right story. And it feels like we're going to be in a good place to move forward. There are different types of NDAs. I'm not going to have time to dive into these, but just understand that there's basically reason codes, right? Where you get to tell FDA, well, this is why we're submitting the FDA to get this done, right? Some of them, the wording I think is pretty clear there. Some of them are a little bit vague on when you would use them. There is guidance available through FDA on how to apply this, but just be aware that you do have to kind of indicate to them why am I submitting this NDA. And then in terms of required information, this is a very short list, but obviously all that clinical trial data that you've generated and the results in your analysis of it is going to be submitted. You need to show them what you think the labeling for the drug is going to look like. What is it going to say? How is it going to be laid out? Does it meet all the requirements in the guidance documents and in the regulations for labeling? Have you provided the right instructions for use, dosage, and all that kind of stuff? You're going to need to provide technical information, right? That backs up what is the formulation, right? What's the chemistry on this thing? Again, back to how are you producing it? What's the process for turning that into the final drug product? You have to provide patent information. How are you going to patent this formulation? Obviously, that wouldn't apply to a generic with an abbreviated NDA, but since it's a new drug application, they also want to see how you're going to patent it. And, do you have a case for making this unique, right? Meaning that can you make a case for this being a new drug? And then there are lots and lots more things that are going to go with it. Again, 21 CFR Part 314 is going to lay that out for you. All right, here's what you need to do, to put together an NDA and all the information that you might need to provide. So just be aware. It's, as you would expect, you're going to be providing a lot at this point. And so you need to understand what that requirement is going to look like. FDA does an initial review. They have 60 days, right, that they're shooting for. Again, it's sort of like what they did in the pre-NDA. Now that you've given them everything, right? Like the pre-NDA was kind of the initial review. Are you actually ready? Now they're going to say, all right, now actually give us the stuff you said you were going to give us in the pre-NDA meeting. Now we're going to actually look through it and make sure it is reviewable, basically, is what they're looking for, right? Before they go involve a lot more people at FDA, they're going to go, is this actually something that looks ready and makes sense and maybe even has a decent chance of getting through the process? Once they give you back that, acknowledgement that, yep, our initial review is complete and we're going to move this forward in the process, then what they're shooting for is approximately 10 months for a substantive review. But as we're going to talk about a little bit, there are some ways to literally, they call it fast tracking. There are some other programs as well to possibly get that down to 6 months. And I'm going to talk at the very end about an announcement that just came out last week about a process where they might be able to get it down under 2 months in certain situations. But that's the kind of the timing you're looking at. Once they agree, once you submit, they'll take 2 months to figure out whether or not it goes forward, and then 10 or maybe as low as 6 months to come back and tell you, are you going to be allowed to market this drug or not? In that 10-month or 6-month period, expect that they're also going to want to come inspect your facilities. It's almost a given, unless, if you're a known manufacturer and this is just a variant on something you've done before and they've seen that plant before, they may not. They may ask for some information rather than coming on site, but expect that as part of this process, they're going to want to come on site and do an inspection. Just a time check here. So in terms of the regulations, I've used the term CFR quite a bit here. CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations. I always liken it to, think of, you've got a big set of binders with all the US laws in it, okay? And binder number 21 is titled FDA, food and drugs, because there's more than to food and drugs than just FDA. There's also USDA, that kind of thing. But chapter 1 is titled Food and Drug Administration. Okay, this is where we want to be. And then there are subchapters, one for med device, one for drugs, one for biologics, right? So now you start to say, all right, now I'm starting to figure out how to traverse all this stuff. And then part refers to the individual regulations within the subchapter. Get ready. When you're doing a drug, there are potentially a lot of regulations that you'll need to comply with. You won't necessarily have to comply with all of these. As you look through the titles, you'll get a sense for, right, I'm not doing that, so that one wouldn't, right? 315, diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals. Well, that's not what I'm doing. Okay, I'm not doing an orphan drug. I don't have to do that one. But the majority of this is going to apply to you regardless of the type of drug you are. 201, drug labeling, 202, 203, right? There's no getting away from those. In bold, I have 210, 211, because that's typically what people think about most when they go, oh, drug regulations. Yeah, I have to comply with 210, 211. All right, that's what I'm showing is that's not all of it. Those two are important in terms of how you manufacture a drug, but you can see 207, how do I get registered as a drug manufacturer? 310, there's my new drug process. 312, the IND process. 314, the NDA process. So you need to be aware of what's in all of these regulations and figure out which ones are applicable to you, because again, you're going to need to demonstrate conformance and compliance to them as part of the NDA process. All right. There's also guidance documents. They have all the regulations, right? The you must do this. And then there's all the, hey, you should also do this. FDA relies a lot on guidance documents from the International Council for Harmonization, or ICH, who has developed a lot of really good guidance documents. You can see based on the titles, right? If you're making APIs, right? They've got a guidance on how to manage that. If you're trying to figure out how to address the risks, analyze your risks of your drug, ICH Q9 will handle that. You need to put up a quality system to manage, right, control quality and manage quality. Q10 is where you can learn more about, well, what does that look like in a drug operation, and so on. And then FDA has its own guidance documents. So this list gets longer yet. There is a database, an FDA guidance database on their website that you should get familiar with, where you can do keyword searches and go, all right, I'm doing this type of drug. Is there any guidance that mentions that keyword in there, right? Or a class of drugs, or a type of treatment or disease you're dealing with. You'll want to look through that database and see, is there anything that mentions that we should be aware of? And then I just add this note here. I always kind of joke that I don't think FDA actually understands the definition of guidance. Guidance typically means optional. Understand that when FDA issues a guidance document, that's what they expect you to do. Okay, and they're going to ask, okay, did you follow our guidance? And if you say no, you better have really good explanations for why you chose not to use excuse me, their guidance on this, or any of the ones that they said, hey, you should be looking at the ICH guidance documents. So just understand that's a strong recommendation, we'll say. All right, let's look at some ways to make this faster. So like I said, there are these other pathways that can help you out. And there's 4 of them that we're going to talk about. There's fast track, breakthrough, accelerated, and priority. I mentioned priority earlier. So let's look at that fast track designation first. Basically, it's intended to speed up drugs, to the market that treat serious conditions and fill an unmet medical need. Right? There's nothing out there that treats that. I think we've figured it out. Right? FDA wants to hear about that and go, well, we should do that as quickly as possible. You've got to make the case for, well, why is this important, right? Does it have effects on patient survival? Does it improve their quality of life through day-to-day functioning? Or does it head off that the disease could progress to something even worse? Right, you're trying to make that case for where are the benefits to the patients that they can't possibly get today, and so we should move this quickly. But basically, you have to show that your drug is superior in terms of effectiveness, or that or it improves the type of side effects and avoiding certain side effects. Yeah, current treatment always makes people really nauseous. Ours does not, right? That would be really good. Maybe it aids in getting an early diagnosis. We use this drug, we can find out something much earlier, which helps us then avoid that progression to something worse. Maybe it's less toxic to people, right? Because there are drugs that are out there that have some toxicity to them. Maybe you figured out how to avoid that. And then there's just general public health needs. Look, this is a public problem. We could impact that, right? That, again, would get you that fast track designation. The benefits of this is that now you get more interaction with FDA, right? You get their attention. Typically, you get a dedicated team to focus on you. You get accelerated reviews of your applications, right? Basically, your paperwork goes to the top of the pile is the way it works. And this one's really cool. You get the ability to have a rolling review of your NDA. So in other words, instead of having to wait for all of your information to be ready to submit your NDA, you can submit it in pieces. We know this much now. FDA start looking at it while we go generate the next piece of set of information. And then we deliver that, right? So you can do this more evolutionary approach, or what they call a rolling review, to get to the finish line quicker. Typically, you'd want to bring this up at the point at which you're doing an IND. That's the time to get this on the radar for them, so they can start thinking about it and make a decision as part of making the decision about your IND. Right? And it could also help expedite that as well. They have what's called breakthrough therapy designation, right? So this is for drugs that demonstrate substantial improvements over available therapies for serious conditions, right? So it might not be that now, there's nothing there before and now there is. There are treatments. Ours is much, much better, right? And again, it improves various issues surrounding the current, standard of care. And so, yeah, we should probably move that through, right, as a breakthrough in new capabilities. It's going to invite, it should imply, right? You have to have pretty clear, at least preliminary clinical evidence to support that. And you're going to need to back it up with something. Obviously, you may not have gotten through all of your clinical trials, but maybe you got through your phase 1, maybe your phase 2, and you're going, oh, this is looking really good, right? We need to get this in front of FDA and go, let's move this even faster. Your evidence has to be based on clinically significant endpoints, they call them, right? That basically you're addressing things like what they call irreversible morbidity or mortality, IMM. Basically, you're going to save lives here. Or again, you're heading off the more serious consequences of a disease, okay? That we can help people not have to, have some sort of surgery to remove some organ or limb or something that normally is common as this disease progresses. So if you get this, you get all of the benefits we talked about on the previous slide for fast track. You get help basically with development of your drug, right? So you get a lot more guidance from FDA. And again, you get a team that focuses on you at FDA. So their senior management is going to pay attention to this rather than just the normal staff will focus on it. Typically, the company would ask for this, but actually FDA, sometimes when they're doing different reviews, they can pick up on this and they can actually recommend it and suggest it. And then talk to the company, go, hey, you know what? We think like this is showing good promise and probably would qualify for breakthrough. Do you want to pursue that? So it's not always the company that has to initiate it. Again, FDA has a desire to get things out to the market and benefit, patients. That's their charter, right? So they will watch for this as well. All right, then there's accelerated approval. So this one's interesting. It sounds like some of the others, right? So it's approval for drugs for serious conditions that fill an unmet need, but based on what they call surrogate endpoints. And what that means is that you've got a clinical marker or something right in the data that isn't directly a measurement of the clinical benefit, but it could indicate a likelihood of getting that benefit. And so this comes right out of in one of the FDA web pages. They give an example of if your drug starts to show early promise that it can shrink tumors, and you know that tumors are bad, okay, you could make the conclusion that this would be better for patients in terms of their survival. Okay, we don't have anything that proves that it increases their survival rates, but logically, right? So that's the idea of the surrogate. If you can demonstrate that logic that says, look, it definitely does this really well, and that should imply this. We are going to test that, okay? So it doesn't exempt you from completing your trial, but it does start to speed things up, right? FDA is going to, all right, we are going to pay attention to you as we were with some of the other programs. Just be aware that so you could even get an early approval on this while you're still completing, some of your trials, but understand they can always pull that back if the data doesn't actually pan out, right? If you get through your clinical trials and it's going, oops, actually that correlation doesn't seem to be there, then they have the ability to tell you, sorry, your drug is no longer approved. And then we have priority review. As I said, this is where they can expedite it from 10 months down to about 6 months, right? Those aren't hard and fast timelines. But basically, it's, if you're showing that, hey, we have improved safety or effectiveness, again, we can prevent serious conditions compared to what's out there today. We can reduce drug interactions. We can improve patient compliance, right? That's always a concern is will the patients actually follow the drug regimen, right? If it makes them not feel well, like from the reactions, right, then they may skip, right, the drug or not stop using it. And maybe you say, hey, we can actually extend this to, it was only for adults. Now it turns out it would work for teenagers, right, for that population. So those kind of things will get you the ability for, the FDA to go, yeah, we should probably move this along. Again, you have to request it. Well, actually, again, it's one of those things where FDA may note it and go, hey, this sounds like something we should do a priority review on. But if you think you've got the case for it as the manufacturer, you can request it as well. All right, and then the last piece here, this breaking news, literally a week ago, FDA talked about what they're calling the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program, where their goal is to reduce review time down to 1 or 2 months. Okay, wow. Hang on, don't get too excited yet. So, but what it means is basically FDA is going to go, if we think you fit this, we'll bring in all the experts we need from within FDA for a 1-day review. Right? We'll pull everything together, we'll get this team together, and we will do a team-based approach, get everybody in the room and spend the day talking about it. However, what it's intended for is things that are of a national priority, as the name would imply. So a health crisis like COVID, and it's meant to mimic what they did to get the COVID vaccines out, right? Where you go, look, we can't sit around and wait on this. We have a serious epidemic or pandemic or something going on. Maybe it's just, this is like a really innovative cure, right? We finally cured cancer, something like that, right? I mean, obviously you don't want to be waiting around on that. Again, that unmet public health needs, right? This has a huge potential to impact the general public. Or from a strategic perspective, this gives us the ability to bring this back into the US rather than relying on foreign entities for it, right? All of those are considered national priorities. You have to, of course, provide a lot of data. So all of your chemistry, manufacturing, controls information, or your CMC information, the labeling has to be there. And whatever you have for preclinical or preliminary clinical data, whether that's preclinical or phase 1, phase 2 kind of stuff, they're going to need that to shore it up beyond just I can make the case for why this is important to the country, then now back it up with the data. Interestingly, the vouchers can be issued for a specific drug, or they've allowed for it could be given to a company to say, all right, what you're working on in general is a national priority. So as a company, you get the voucher, and any drug you produce now gets to go through this expedited 1 to 2 month review process. They did. Now, there's not a lot of details yet, proceduralized. They haven't done that. So there's a lot of questions. Mark and I have been sort of asking ourselves, so what will this look like? Well, how will they do this? They haven't released that yet. Obviously, it's only been a week. And they made it clear this is going to be pretty limited. Not a lot of companies are going to qualify for this, but they are allowed for when it's important. They have a method to do this as they did, during COVID. All right, I think, yeah, well, we're 1 minute over. Sorry about that. But what kind of questions are on people's minds?